technical director, also dealing with foreign and security policy. Since his retirement, Rory has been an honorary professor at Queen's University in the George Mitchell Institute for Peace, Security and Justice, which brings together experts from diverse fields to share their background with work and to work collaboratively on specific projects of interest and associated with the aims of the Institute. And Rory is also, since he retired, he is a public policy fellow in Trinity College in Dublin, where his work focus is on the place of Ireland in the European Union and on the future relationships on the island of Ireland and between Ireland and the UK. And he is also since 2022 chair of the Press Council of Ireland, among other things. I won't list them go any further, but as you can see how well he is qualified to speak to us on all of those topics this evening. So along the lines of our usual programme structure, Rory will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will split into smaller groups, which Ian kindly arranges with his technological expertise, and discuss the two questions that will be in the chat box. On reconvening, Rory will deliver the second part of his address, after which we will have a plenary discussion moderated by Reverend Johnston McMaster, and then we will aim to conclude at 9 p.m. So Rory, as I say, you're extremely welcome. We're delighted you're with us this evening. So I could say the floor is yours, but at least the frame is yours. So we're delighted to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, and Mary, and thank you very much to everybody in Dunlaoghaire and in South Belfast for this invitation. It's a real honour to be here, and in my time working on Northern Ireland, I suppose I was very conscious of the positive role of the Methodist Church and also of individual Methodists, including the Reverend Harold Good and also Gordon Wilson, whom I had the great privilege of getting to know on the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, which was chaired by Catherine McGuinness between 1994 and 1996, and of which I was a member of the Secretariat. Just as it was a little bit about my own personal history, because it may be relevant to you, my parents are both from Northern Ireland. My mother from Belfast. She was brought up just off the Lisburn Road with the help of a Belfast City Scholarship. She made it to Methody and then down to Trinity. My father was brought up in Green Island, went to Inst, and also went to Trinity, which is where they met. They would have been Presbyterians in their upbringing and at university, but they both moved away from that faith later on. My relations would all be resident in Northern Ireland, mostly North Belfast, and the strip running up to Carrickfergus and Whitehead. I suppose my parents lived a brief time in London, but they came back to Dublin before I was born. And I suppose I was in the rather odd experience of growing up in what was largely a sort of South Dublin Protestant bubble, with its own sort of infrastructure and ecosystem, which will be well known to many of you. And I often say, and it isn't entirely a joke, that I really only got to know Catholics in large numbers when I went to Trinity College, where most of my best friends were from a diverse set of backgrounds, including from Northern Ireland. And there's another dimension as well, I suppose, which is that my son, and this has nothing whatever to do with our family history, my son, Johnny, he is actually married and living in Belfast. While a student in Dublin, or just after he graduated, he met this young woman from Belfast, Maeve Bell, who was a medical student at Trinity. She was always keen to go back up north and work with her father and others in practice on the Upper Ormeau Road, which is where she's now working. And I have two little grandsons, Finn and Fergus, born in Belfast 2 years ago and 2 months ago, respectively. So I feel I have quite a stake in the future of Northern Ireland. And in foreign affairs, as Mary said, in addition to the various things I did abroad and on EU policy, I also worked for 8 years in the Anglo-Irish Division Department, between 1993 and 2001, which were quite significant years, of course. One footnote on Mary, we worked together in various roles over the years, but in fact, before I even joined the Department of Foreign Affairs, it was she, as head of personnel, who sent me the letter saying in June '83, saying that I was being appointed to the department, which was great news. So I still have that letter somewhere on the pale blue paper, which was the paper used for external correspondence at that time. So I thought, I'm very conscious in speaking to this audience that I don't want to go into undue detail. I don't want to teach my grandmother how to suck eggs. You all know, or many of you know, a great deal more from a personal point of view and from an expert point of view about some of these issues than I do. But I thought it might be useful to offer a kind of a broader perspective and to draw some, again, very broad conclusions, or more particularly, I suppose, derive some questions from my experience and from what I observe around me. I mean, I think maybe it'd be no harm to talk a little bit about Brexit. It features in the title of the lecture, and of course, as everybody knows, it's been a phenomenally difficult issue, not least for Northern Ireland, over the last 7 years plus. I think it's fair to say that there was very little understanding in Britain and in large parts of Northern Ireland about the consequences Brexit could have. I think we in the Irish government were aware that there would be consequences, though we weren't quite sure what those might be. But from an early point, we started working on issues. And that meant that we were a step ahead of the British government when it came to formulating positions on the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland and what needed to be done to mitigate those consequences. And we were successful through an extremely active diplomatic campaign, really intense, over 400 meetings at the level of Taoiseach, ministers, senior officials like myself, with our EU counterparts over about a 6 or 7 month period before the European Council initially adopted its broad guidelines for negotiations. And there was this commitment to defending the Good Friday Agreement, protecting it in all its aspects. But I think it's fair to say that the Irish government quite quickly, while there were, of course, other very important aspects of the Good Friday Agreement, including human rights, which were emphasised, there was no doubt that we put a particular stress on the potential impact of Brexit on the border and on the movement of people and goods and so on between North and South. And I think those who say that perhaps this was a one-sided or a somewhat imbalanced interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement, I don't know that we'd have seen it as such at the time, but with hindsight, I think to a degree that was true. But I think the principal problem was, in all honesty, was that for a range of reasons, the British government, either because it didn't understand the issues fully, and I should say that very few people on its side in the British government, in fact, nobody in the British government working on these issues knew anything much about Northern Ireland. And the Northern Ireland office was cut out of negotiations very largely, and the Northern Ireland Civil Service, whereas a lot of us working on the Irish side had a lot of experience of working on Northern Ireland, had a better understanding of the issue. Eventually then agreed to this concept of there being alignment between North and South, which effectively meant continuation of Northern Ireland in the single market and in the customs union for the purposes of goods. And from that basic agreement, in principle, which was in the autumn of 2017, everything has kind of flowed since. You could argue in the sense that the EU and the Irish government were almost too successful in that phase of negotiations, anxious to move on to other topics. Maybe they thought they would revisit these questions later on, or maybe, as I say, they didn't fully understand what it was about. But then, of course, what this might mean became very clear when the first draft of a protocol was published in early 2018, and that was what Mrs. May famously said no British government could accept. So the next 18 months were basically dominated by attempts on to find ways in which the basic commitments to no hard border on the island, and I say in parenthesis, of course, that hard border is not a legal term or a technical term, it was a metaphor, and it interpreted exactly as it was. That's another open question. 18 months were dominated by these attempts to find an alternative to to the protocol as proposed by the Commission. And as we all know, with great effort, Theresa May came up with a system whereby the whole of the UK would, to some extent, remain for practical purposes, in the single market and customs union, therefore obviating the need for a special treatment of Northern Ireland. That was roundly rejected by her own party and by the House of Commons in general. One could ask the question, if Labour at the time, under Jeremy Corbyn, had been prepared to join forces with May, what might have happened? But I never felt that was realistic, despite the great efforts of people like Keir Starmer, indeed, who was Brexit spokesman at the time, and David Lidington on the British side. And then, of course, we came into the case where Britain left the EU. The protocol came into effect, and as you know as well as I do, it very quickly ran into public difficulty, despite the fact that a number of prominent unionists, including Arlene Foster, thought at first that it might be workable and would give Northern Ireland the best of both worlds. I suppose we'll never actually know how the protocol would have worked in full. Was it probably too severe? Maybe. How serious would the implications have been in practice? We just don't know, because there was a series of grace periods extended unilaterally by the British government. The EU, I always thought myself, was perhaps there were a couple of factors it didn't sufficiently take into account: the very small size of the Northern Ireland market, the fact that the trade between the two parts of Ireland is trade on an island, and the risks of leakage outside the island are maybe not that great. And then, of course, the fact that the constitutional and political situation of Northern Ireland is totally different from that of any third country with which the EU would have trade relations. However, that being as it may, the likelihood of the EU revisiting its position in any substantive way was perhaps never that great. There had been this very intense negotiation, and I think it's fair to say that the level of hostility and aggression, and frankly, mendicancy and bad faith, mendacity, I should say, and bad faith coming from the British government under Johnson with David Frost and so on, was such as not to inspire any belief that there was a proper interlocutor in place. Then, as we know, with the change of Prime Minister, the Windsor Framework was negotiated. It's now been operational since the 1st of October. I'm not aware so far of that it's encountering many practical problems. It isn't all fully in place yet, but we'll see. But I think what is clear, I think everybody will agree that there is no chance this time of the European Union revisiting it. And the British government, I'm told very clearly, has no intention of revisiting it either. So it's here to stay. Not to say that if there are problems arise in this operation, they can't be tweaked. I should say, by the way, just a footnote, that of course the DUP, and Jeffrey Donaldson was saying this at the weekend, the DUP can of course say correctly that its opposition to the protocol did force the British government and the European Union, the Commission, into a sort of a redrafting of the protocol or parts of the protocol. So that, to that extent, and you may ask the question, was it worth it or has it been worth it? But you could say that this tactic actually played a certain part. But I think the scope for further such tactics is very limited. Just two final points about Brexit very briefly. The first is, of course, that at the beginning of the process, everybody thought that nationalists and nationalism would be the losers, that they were the ones being cut off, as it were, from the EU, despite their overwhelming wish to stay within it, and they would be the ones who would suffer from a sort of reinforced border, if you like. Whereas in reality, of course, it hasn't been that way at all. It's been the unionist community which has been roiled by Brexit and has faced the more severe consequences, and which certainly politically, at some levels, believes itself to be the ill-treated partner. And another final point, I suppose, Brexit is that the economic impact overall for the island is still not clear. I mean, there are statistics which show a substantial increase in trade between North and South. It's not 100% clear to me, and to many others, we don't have enough data yet for long enough that that is all actually new business, or is it simply a diversion of existing business which would have gone from Britain into Ireland or whatever. But overall, it does look as if Brexit, insofar as it is having an effect in Northern Ireland, it has the potential to have a positive economic effect, but we'll see. And then just a few observations then on the Good Friday Agreement and its possible reform. Because obviously Brexit has played its own very significant part in destabilizing the agreement. I mean, a few very quick points. First of all, about that, about the Good Friday Agreement. And as Mary said, I was very much involved. In the 90s, I started off working on equality, human rights, fair employment issues. Then I moved on to the political side. I was involved in preparing for the talks, and I was part of the team which negotiated the agreement. I did a lot of the drafting of the institutional and constitutional parts. But a few general observations, and this is not particularly a criticism of the agreement, but I think at times there's a sort of tendency to talk about it as if it had been handed down on engraved in tablets of stone, and it wasn't. I mean, first of all, there were two streams which made up the Good Friday Agreement. There was the peace process, so-called, which was essentially involving Republicans on the one. The principal interlocutors were the Republican movement, the IRA, Sinn Féin, and the British government, with the Irish government and the Loyalists also, of course, playing an important part. And that was about issues to do with the ending of conflict as such, prisoners, guns, military installations, all of that. But there was also the rather longer running stream of constitutional discussion and institutional discussion amongst the mainstream parties, as we would have called them at the time, the constitutional parties. And I think it's fair to say that those two streams never kind of fully merged before the agreement. And an interesting consequence of that was that Sinn Féin in particular played virtually no role in serious discussion of the institutional, constitutional and other elements of the Good Friday Agreement. Sinn Féin had two preoccupations: the release of prisoners and avoiding decommissioning. And of course it wanted to give the appearance of being actively involved, but it wasn't really. Secondly, then, clearly at no point were all of the main parties around the table at the same time. The DUP and Robert McCarthy were there to begin with, walked out when Sinn Féin came in. So the final outcome was not 100% representative. If the DUP had stayed, would there have been an agreement? Almost certainly not. But it's just worth remembering. There was tremendous haste and confusion. The old cliche about the fog of war was extremely vividly in my mind. The whole thing was really, the texts were negotiated extremely quickly in a matter of 3-4 weeks in reality, mostly between the British and Irish governments, and then with input from the parties on points of particular concern to them. So a lot of things were sort of decentralized, as it were. I mean, the Irish government principally spoke to the UUP about North-South. SDLP and the UUP spoke about Strand 1 institutions. Sinn Féin spoke to the British government about prisoners and spoke to us about decommissioning, etc. It was very much, as everybody has said since, a top-down process. Very little role, in fact, no role at all, really, meaningfully, in the talks themselves, whatever about the supporting infrastructure for community groups, social partners, others, very much, as they led by politicians and led by male politicians above all, with the honourable exception of the Women's Coalition, who did have an impact beyond their, not as large an impact as some of the other parties, of course, but an impact beyond their size. And then, of course, finally, now with hindsight, it seems very obvious that some very important issues were left out of the agreement, dealing with sectarianism, dealing with victims, how to cope with legacy questions. Had there been an attempt to bring these in, I think many people would argue that there would have been no agreement, but the focus was overwhelmingly on the constitutional and institutional questions, plus then policing, justice, and the consequences of conflict, if you like, and the importance of the, again with hindsight, the huge importance of North-South issues in the negotiations seems a bit lopsided. Then, of course, as you will all remember, or many of you will remember, there was a very close call in the referendum on the unionist side of the House. I mean, yes, there was a substantial 94% majority in the Republic, though only 56% of us voted, which was pretty poor, I always thought. And in Northern Ireland, yes, 71-29. But, that was whether there was a majority of the unionist Protestant community voting in favour or not. It was a fine, close-run thing. Nobody will know for certain. And a really fascinating thing I learned from a recent piece of research by University College London is that in a report, very good report on the Good Friday Agreement 25 years on, but they conducted a range of focus groups with different sets of people, and it was quite remarkable. I mean, some people had almost no memory of the agreement at all. There was one man who said that he'd forgotten more or less all about it until he'd seen it on Derry Girls in the last episode. And there was another, but many of them of the unionists who took part, the one thing they remembered was prisoner release as being an important part of the agreement. Remembered it in an overwhelmingly negative way, and I've always thought that's really in a way important, but also a proxy for the admission of responsibility, the admission of guilt, the wearing of sackcloth and ashes, as Ian Paisley once put it, by republicanism, etc. Obviously, the institutions eventually got up and running, but I think they were, I think in a way the agreement was extremely, I wouldn't say fatally, but seriously weakened from the very start by the endless wrangling over decommissioning, which meant that the institutions couldn't work properly for most of the first couple of years, that the focus on the national side was entirely on Sinn Féin, and the SNP was not able to point to any achievements from the agreement, and on the whole, the David Trimble, who was trying desperately to find ways forward, was made to look weak and at times gullible. And I really think that was a serious drawback. And I think maybe things could have been different. I'm not sure. I don't think it was the finest hour of the two governments at that point. I suppose when you look at the agreement itself, and you ask yourself how effective has it been, again, we all have our views, but in a very quick sort of checklist of ways. Obviously, with Strand 1, institutions, that's where the focus mostly lies. Those institutions are at the heart of the agreement. They were originally, it was very much the John Hume idea that by bringing people together, they would develop mutual understanding, it would improve relationships between communities and so on. Obviously, there have been these long periods where the agreement, the institutions have not functioned, and that continues to be the case now. There are some rumblings that maybe there'll be a change in the next little while. I don't know. But even apart from that, real doubts about the effectiveness, the good governance offered by these institutions, by the executive in particular, a sense that there's a lack of coherence, a lack of a common program, and a tendency to avoid difficult decisions and for people to cancel each other out, if you like. North-South, as I said earlier, it was a hugely important part of the negotiation. In practice, in all honesty, the impact of the North-South institutions, both the implementation bodies and the North-South Ministerial Council, has been quite modest, not insignificant in some ways. It's partly because there's been absolutely no preparedness on the part of the unionists, either UUP or DUP, to expand their scope or make them more active and dynamic, going beyond the original definitions. I think it's also perhaps an expression of the reality that, again, being the whole important cooperation takes place, if you like, organically when there's an obvious need for it. That's certainly the city market, which is the single biggest North-South integration step of the last 20 years. Having said that, there's a lot that could be done in areas like health and education if there was a greater capacity to use the institutions properly. Strand 3, people get very mixed up about Strand 3. It means, because it's used quite often to mean the relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. That's how it's been used in the Brexit discussion, the protocol discussion. But in fact, it has three different elements, two other elements. There's the British-Irish Council, which is effectively a talking shop, bringing together, of some value, bringing together the governments, devolved administrations, and the Channel Isles and the Isle of Man. And it's a good place for people to meet periodically. And it has some programs, but they're of a modest character. And then there's the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which was effectively a sort of the shadow off, the remnant of the old Anglo-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. It hasn't played much of a part over the last 20 years. It's been revived to a certain degree during the current period of stalemate, but we'll see. Then, just going quickly, then the other, looking at the balance sheet, I would have said that the achievements of the agreement in regard to policing were in some ways overwhelmingly the most, I won't say the most significant, but they were hugely welcome and important. Obviously, there are issues in policing at the moment. There are issues about continuing threats. There's the question of whether the community balance may be going backwards in the wrong direction. And there's the question of morale within the police, though, mind you, we have problems in the south as well with morale within the Gardaí, and there are problems in Britain too, as we know. But policing overall, I have to say, has been a really important step forward, as is the reform of criminal justice. And then sectarianism, paramilitarism, you're better placed to know than I am. The impression one has is that in many ways people are mixing together, working together better than before, but that there remain very serious unresolved issues, particularly in urban and working class communities, and above all when it comes to paramilitarism on the Protestant loyalist side. I suppose what people will say if they're asked, well, what does the Good Friday Agreement achieve? Will say, above all, peace. It has stopped people dying, and that is undoubtedly true. I've always thought it would be an interesting thought experiment if there hadn't been an agreement on the night of the 9th and 10th of April. What would have happened then? On what basis? If David Trimble, in other words, had failed to get his party to agree to allow him go forward, what then would paramilitaries have done? On what basis would they have justified a quote return to war, unquote? So everyone had accepted the mutual principles and so on by then. So it's an interesting question, and just a purely academic question at this stage. And then looking to the future, obviously there's a lot of talk on the Good Friday Agreement. There's a lot of talk about changes. Again, you'll be better aware of it than I am. The fact that there is the rise of a middle ground of people, unwilling to define themselves too narrowly as unionist or nationalist, who see themselves very often as Northern Irish, primarily Irish and British as well. Although, mind you, of course, I think to some extent this phenomenon can be exaggerated, it would seem, from the south, in that the two larger traditional blocs remain a lot bigger. So is there a way in which you can avoid or reduce the specific role of designation in the assembly? That's talked about. The appointment of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, it was changed at St Andrews, as everyone remembers, so that the two were appointed separately. Personally, again, I'm not convinced that made a huge difference. I think you would have had the same pair of people at the top, no matter what system you'd had. Because there would need to get a vote through the assembly under the original system. There's talk of changing the titles. There's talk of then imposing a sort of a right to opt out, as it were, that a party which is entitled to hold the post of either First Minister or Deputy First Minister can be bypassed if in certain circumstances, or can opt out. Now, how likely any of these is, these are really questions for Northern Ireland itself, people in Northern Ireland. I think I'd say that my generation, and maybe this is a feature of age, and this is the last second last point I'll make. The fundamental point remains that the Good Friday Agreement, rightly at the time, rightly or wrongly, question mark now, was based on this concept of there being two communities in Northern Ireland. And even if there are now more than two communities, even if there always were more than two communities, there remain two communities which are bigger than the rest. And could you actually devise rules under which stable government could be offered, leaving the majority representatives of one or the other group out? And that's a pretty fundamental question. A lot of us who worked in the Good Friday Agreement would say that, that in fact to change the system to that extent would effectively be to change the Good Friday Agreement itself radically. That may be necessary, but I think we have to be realistic about what would be involved. And some of the changes are cosmetic, and the more serious ones are quite radical. Finally, then, for now, before I stop, Plan B is talked about. This is the question of what happens if we don't find a way to restore devolution. It's talked about from time to time, and it's generally interpreted as being a greater role for the Irish government. operating under the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which, as I say, is kind of the child, the unacknowledged child of the Anglo-Irish Intergovernmental Conference of the 80s and 90s. And this was used back in 2007 by Ian Paisley as a way to frighten people into supporting the DUPs entering the executive of Sinn Féin. I think I think there would be a strong desire on the part of nationalists and of the Irish government for the Irish government to play a somewhat greater role. What this would actually mean in practice, though, is not clear to me. I'm not sure that there is a firm legal basis within the agreement for it. I would have thought there was under Strand 3. That's what most people in the Republic would believe. I thought so, but I listened to a very convincing counter argument from Andrew McCormack, who may be known to some of you, former senior Northern Ireland civil servant, who did a very close analysis and questions that there is this capacity there in quite the way we think. Second problem would be this, that when the Irish government was involved very much in a consultative role in the 80s and 90s, the issues we were dealing with at the time were all ones to do with inter-community relations, and more specifically, I suppose, issues faced by nationalists in general. The questions of employment equality, the question of parade, what was perceived to be hostile policing, etc. Those issues, thank goodness, have now largely dissipated. The head of the Equality Commission, Evelyn Collins, commented that, in fact, in the last year or so, religion has dwindled to almost negligible proportions as a basis for complaints under equality legislation, well behind questions of race, disability, gender, sexual orientation, etc. So the question would be, well, the Irish government, what exactly would be the capacity of the Irish government to offer a meaningful input on questions of, hospital planning in Northern Ireland, or changes to the education system, or whatever it might be. I'm not saying that these questions would not be addressed seriously, but they raise questions. So whistle-stop tour through Brexit and through the functioning of the Good Friday Agreement and some of the issues which arise in the future. The second part is going to be a discussion, or the second question I suggested for this evening, the question of whether talking about United Ireland is necessary or not, premature, distracting, vexatious, etc. So thank you very much for your patience for this first round.
By Reverend Dr. Johnson McMaster. So it's over to you, Rory. You'll need to, I think everybody is muted. You'll need to unmute yourself, Rory, please, and then we'll go into your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I very much enjoyed being in breakout room 4 and some very interesting opinions expressed there, which there wasn't time, alas, to get to grips with fully. I was going to talk then about the sort of the second question I posed: discussion of United Ireland. Is it essential? Is it premature? Is it a distraction? I suppose it's fair to say that, at least in the political class and the journalistic class, the question of United Ireland is back very much on the table. I suppose the basic question is it also on the table for everybody else? And again, that's something I would find it interesting to hear about from you. Undoubtedly, Brexit has had this disruptive effect. I think the view would be that before the Brexit vote, there was a sense that the institutions of the agreement under first Peter Robinson and then Arlene Foster had kind of settled down, and Martin McGuinness. But certainly the question is very much now back on the agenda. And it's not just, I think, a question of the substance of United Ireland, it's also the whole question of the process, because the way that Brexit unfolded, most people will say, well, this demonstrates the folly of plunging into something without having worked out what it will mean. On the other hand, of course, whether it is possible to say in detail what United Ireland would mean before it happened is, of course, it's an open question for me. Just to say one other thing I do, I'm a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and I'm the only non-academic member of a steering committee of a body which I recommend to you called ARINS, A-R-I-N-S, which is Analysing and Researching Ireland North and South. It's a joint initiative of the Royal Irish Academy, which is the premier all-Ireland scholarly body, dating back to the 1780s, and a Royal Charter, and the University of Notre Dame, which is the university in the US, which has the largest Irish studies program and has a presence in Ireland. And IRONS is a terrible acronym. Ireland's future had been taken by another organization, unfortunately. It would have been much better if we could have called ourselves that. And what we do is we look at questions around the future and the present. We do so in a non-partisan way. We don't just talk about constitutional questions, far from it. We talk about all manner of issues in terms of cooperation, North and South, economic performance, welfare systems, culture, and so on. And Aaron's project will find it online. 37 articles have been published so far in under 3 years, and I do a monthly podcast as well, of which I've now done, I think, 25. So anyway, but I will draw to some extent on the work that Aaron's has done in talking about this, because it came to most attention. There was a series of polls, which some of you may be aware of, which were published in the Irish Times in December and January, 9 polls in total about the whole question of many questions to do with United Ireland. And this was a joint venture of the Irish Times and of the Aaron's project. And then a lot of the substantive research, which has been done as well on particular topics, is also very interesting and very relevant. I think, first thing to say, the Friday Agreement itself says very little indeed about United Ireland. As you know, it does provide for the Secretary of State to call a referendum at any time, but when he, that's what the legislation says, he or she believes that it's likely that a majority would vote in favour. And, some people say there should be strict criteria to determine this assessment. Others say, including the courts up to now, there should be a wide margin of political appreciation. And my personal view is the latter is probably a better way to do it, but we'll see. But I say the Good Friday Agreement, it doesn't say much. Even, for example, it's not clear. It talks about a concurrent exercise of self-determination, North and South. Does concurrent mean simultaneous votes in the North and the South? Again, some say yes, and others say, well, not necessarily. They can be as long as the same rough time period. But as I say, the Aaron's polls are very interesting, and they've been supplemented too by some focus groups, which I also find extremely useful, because an opinion poll, as everyone always says, is only a snapshot. And a lot of the time people are being asked questions which they haven't really thought about. If you were simply somebody, random member of the public, and somebody says, can I come and talk to you about this? And you say yes, you'll be asked all sorts of questions, and you might well never have thought about them. And that's what many people in the focus groups said. The focus groups in particular concentrated on people who said they didn't have an opinion or hadn't made up their minds. And as they talked through the questions, they developed often quite different understandings of things. So I suppose an interesting question is it an important issue in Northern Ireland or is it not? People say, of course, that it is economic issues and social issues and public services which matter most to people on a day-to-day basis, and I'm sure that's true, and it's true everywhere. On the other hand, if you look at the history of the last, since the first Home Rule Bill in the 1880s, you'd have to say that the constitutional/national question has had this capacity to force itself into the centre of the picture. I think in the South, it's fair to say there's actually very little interest in the South in a strong way. Conor Cruise O'Brien once called it a low intensity aspiration, and I think that remains a very accurate description. Some of the research has demonstrated as well the huge levels of incomprehension which exist between North and South. One of the Aaron's polls was about the extent of interconnection kind of across the border. Now, of course, you'd expect people living a long way away from each other to be less likely to know or to visit. But it's particularly true of Southerners vis-a-vis the North. Obviously, people in Munster less likely to know anybody in Ulster. But even closer to the border on both sides, there is less interaction socially in terms of work and so on, then you might expect there to be within that sort of geographical radius in other places, including across the border between in Luxembourg or Switzerland and France or whatever. And the level of ignorance too is great. In the focus group I mentioned, or focus groups, again, people from the south could not really answer the most basic questions about aspects of Northern Ireland, how it operated, and sort of the same in reverse. So there's a terrible lot of ignorance, and I don't say that pejoratively. It's just people have their lives to live, but it doesn't mean they don't have important instincts. The one exception I should say to the question of sort of degree and management is Derry and Dunlaoghaire. That's the one part of the country where there is a kind of what you might call a normal flow back and forth and between the two parts of the Republic and the North. I mean, the headline poll figures, if the Aaron's headline poll figure very broadly was 50% in Northern Ireland were opposed to United Ireland or said they'd vote no. 25% said they'd vote yes. 25% said they didn't know, which is quite a large number. That's in line with some other surveys. University of Liverpool. It's a bit different from some others. Lucid Talk, which works with the Belfast Telegraph. The academics behind the Aaron's poll are adamant that their methodology is best. 50% is a handsome lead in one way, 50-25. But it's not a majority. It's only half. It's not a majority. And what was interesting was that when people were probed a bit more in focus groups, there was a greater willingness, I think, on the part of people to change their minds or move from being undetermined to decided. And the tendency seemed to be in the direction of favouring United Ireland. The people who were avowedly undetermined moved in that direction. So it's not quite so clear as all that. But people who had to say, oh, there'll be a referendum in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, they're really talking through their hat. They don't know. And the other thing is, as was mentioned by I think it was Reverend McElhinney in our group, Ken, was that, or Ivan rather, was that was demography, and there's no doubt that there is a declining number of Protestants, declining number of Unionist voters, as we've seen. On the other hand, the increase in nationalist voting hasn't been that great, and you've had this rise of this middle group, and how they would jump is not at all clear. And you have to assume that in many cases, while if they could be put in a time machine and brought 25 years forward to a happily united Ireland, they might be perfectly content. Would they really want to go through all of that stress and hassle and difficulty and potential violence and so on? Good question. So one of the key issues then which have emerged, the question of process then is, there's an argument in some quarters, and it's particularly Sinn Féin, others in the strong nationalist camp, Ireland's Future, I mentioned this organisation, which is really a large lobby group for a border poll. They argue that it is the duty of the Irish government in particular to conduct sort of major citizens' assemblies and other endeavours to come up with a detailed plan for United Ireland and for this to be the basis for discussion. The counter view, I think, from the present government, Micheál Martin in particular, is that this is premature, that we have a lot of things to be getting on with at the moment without this distraction. And another argument, I think, is that having such a discussion in the absence of the great majority of Unionists or the representatives would in some respects be rather futile, that there are many questions, as I'll mention, which can really only be determined with the engagement of people of a Unionist background. And is that likely to happen before a referendum? I mean, the general view is maybe not. So that's but at the same time, people like ourselves and Aaron's are to build up as much information as we can. I think people say, a bit like I said earlier, that, well, what do they say? First of all, a lot of people in civil society groups, women's groups in particular, youth groups, call for a more inclusive process than produced the Good Friday Agreement, a greater role for underrepresented groups to help frame the debate and take part. Maybe as a former official, I think this is very positive, but I do think myself that when the rubber hits the road, it's hard to avoid the ultimate responsibility of political leaders to take the initiative. Then, of course, people will say naturally that what really matters to them are economics and health. What will happen to the health service in the United Ireland? What would happen? And what would the economy be like? What would taxes be? And the trouble with these questions is that, you know, it's not possible really to answer them all that clearly. I mean, of course, you can say that we're going to have an absolutely ideal health service covering the entire island, and it'll solve all the problems of the NHS currently. It'll solve all the problems in the Republic. But that's more like a general election where people make promises. You know, how do you actually demonstrate this? Likewise with tax, you can talk about, yes, you know, what the taxation base would be to begin with. What might it be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? You can't say. So, but health is the existence of the NHS remains the single most important factor persuading those who are not politically strongly committed to the union to favour the union. And I think the argument might be that, in part, it's because people in the north believe that everybody in the south has to pay to visit a doctor, and in turn, people in the south tend to exaggerate the performance of the NHS as it now is. But those are interesting questions. This question, and then the economy, public finances, again, the famous subvention. Again, at the moment, the Irish government is rolling in money, as we know, through corporation tax revenues. It wouldn't be a particular problem to meet the gap. The gap is about £10 billion sterling. How you would actually calculate the gap, it depends on a number of things. Would Northern Ireland or the United Ireland have to assume part of the UK's national debt? What would happen to, where would pensions be paid from? Would public service salaries and welfare payments be equalised between North and South? But I think in general, there's a view that, you know, with difficulty, it would have been impossible 20 years ago to think that the fiscal burden could be shouldered. It's less impossible to imagine now, though there still would be a stretch. And of course, people in the South, when asked about this, are most reluctant to pay a single cent more for unity. Another big question which arises, again, this is really not of immediate interest to the public, but it would be hugely important in reality, is would you continue in United Ireland with devolved institutions as it's Stormont now? Would you have, in other words, same situation as you have now, but with the Irish government, the Dáil taking the place of Westminster? Again, in the polling of Ireland's, a large majority of Northern Ireland Unionists were in favour of that. A fairly, you know, a reasonable majority of Northern Nationalists wouldn't be their first preference, but they could live with it. Strong opposition from most people in the Republic. But again, this is one of these topics which, as it was further probed and talked out and so on, people began to ask themselves the question, well, look, if the institutions aren't working now, how will they work in the future? Will there be vetoes in the same way as there are now? You know, would we be better off, effectively, we Unionists in this case, would we be better off as a large bloc in a new Dáil and with power over all these areas? After all, Sinn Féin would be in the majority in United Ireland, almost by definition, etc. So that's a very important question. A lot of people assume the institutions would continue, but like I say, the more you look into it, the less clear it becomes. And that is a question where it should be, of course, fundamentally important to have a considered unionist input down the road. There are these difficult symbolic issues, flags, anthems, the Commonwealth, the role of the Irish language. I think it's fair to say that there is greater negativity towards these changes in the Republic than there is positivity in the North. In other words, ask, you know, again, the polls, yes, Northern Ireland, people in Northern Ireland, unionists in particular, would if they thought about it, which they haven't, would prefer a new anthem or a new flag. But their emotion is nothing like as strong as the opposition of people, the knee-jerk opposition, you might say, of people in the Republic to any change at all. And you see it all the time when there's always somebody who complains about the playing of Ireland's call before a rugby international, and not just on musical grounds too. So those are interesting. So those are interesting questions. I mean, there is, as I say, again, Northern nationalists, I would say, in many matters, both on the evolution and on the questions of symbols and emblems, are more, or you might say, more pragmatic and more moderate than their Southern counterparts. Having said that, the polls do show a large majority in the South would vote in favour, despite all the concerns. I personally believe that would be the case, despite the issues which might be raised. And also when people begin to look more clearly at the issues, maybe there'd be more flexibility than you might expect. There are a few other issues which would have to be sorted out, and many other issues. A key point would be obviously a transitional arrangement. Would there be a transitional period? How long would it last? Even in terms of timing, would there be how long would there be to prepare a referendum after the Secretary of State term? There had to be one, a year, 18 months, 2 years. What might happen in the interim? And again, what would happen after a referendum? Would there be a period, of preparation? And again, this depends in part on how far you actually have a template ready to go. My own view is that, although I'm slightly in a minority in this in Ireland circles, as I'm a bit skeptical about how much you can say in advance. I think the Irish government can certainly, and nationalist opinion, but the Irish government particularly, can, as it were, set out a sort of annotated agenda for negotiations, and it can say we're willing to accept this or we're willing to accept that, or it seems to us that these are the options. But I think to expect there to be a kind of a fully worked out plan is maybe a bit unlikely. There's the question of policing, of course. Again, would you retain a separate police service in Northern Ireland? Would there be a regionalised approach across the island? How would that work? And then, just to Mary and myself, obviously one of the consequences of a united Ireland would be that Northern Ireland would immediately and automatically rejoin the European Union as part of United Ireland. What about NATO and other foreign policy commitments? Does this matter to people in Northern Ireland? I should say that the question of violence is also one which people mention spontaneously, and people in the south are as likely to mention it as people in the north as a positive concern. And I think this goes back in part to a considerable degree of southern unease about Northern Ireland in general. And it says, and I even know this among some sort of friends of mine and even some family members on the other side. It's a very difficult question. There's a sense that Northerners as a group are sort of, whether they're Catholic or Protestant or National Unionist, they're kind of a bit sort of, they're low unto themselves, and there's a fear undoubtedly of unrest and of violence, and as much in the south as in the north. Now, the Irish government so far has, while there have been a few rhetorical statements by Leo Varadkar and so on about his expectation of United Ireland in his lifetime, though, as I point out, he's only 44 and he looks pretty healthy. So how long will a lifetime be? Who's to say? But I think in general, it's fair to say, and particularly with Micheál Martin as Taoiseach and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the focus has been overwhelmingly on practical cooperation, trying to get the institutions up and running. As you know, a lot of money has been now offered by the Irish government for various projects, including an extension of the nursing department and medical departments in Magee, in the University of Ulster campus in Magee, in Derry, including a contribution to Eastman Stadium, etc. And there's a lot of money, and a lot of money is being spent on really worthy things. On top of the money, Foreign Affairs has already spent a lot on reconciliation projects and so on. So the Irish government has been, it's the view is hasten slowly, and I think that's the view of the large majority of people in the Republic. On the other hand, of course, Sinn Féin, which is certainly, has a strong chance of being the leading party in the next Irish government. Sinn Féin, the commitment to United, absolutely core. It's a fundamental core principle. If it wins the election in the Republic, it won't be because of Northern Ireland. It'll be because of housing and health. But there's no doubt that its activists and leading lights do care a lot about this question. I expect that if they were elected, in part because they will find making progress on other issues very difficult, and they won't want to scare the horses economically with tax rises or so on. Then I think there'll be a lot of noise and rhetoric around United Ireland. There might well be a new minister for reunification in the Taoiseach's department. There'll be white papers, green papers, citizens' assemblies, all the rest of it, to work out some of these, to work out in detail some of these questions I'm talking about. What will happen then, I don't quite know, because if they go to the British government and say, look at this, we have this detailed blueprint, and the British government says, well, that's fine, but we don't see any evidence that the majority of people in Northern Ireland support it, what kind of happens then?